could not be more excited to introduce our trainer tonight. She is one of my closest friends in this field. Marzi Branyan is the voter protection organizer with the Wisconsin Democratic Party. She is currently the lead of the first ever off-cycle voter protection program in the state, which is just so incredible. She has worked in organizing in 4 different states, including the recent Georgia runoffs, which is where we got to know each other. We got to run a team of volunteers and really practice this volunteer retention and volunteer team building, highlighting individual strengths and getting to know these folks on a level that I had never even gotten to do in the past. So there's no one I could think of more qualified to train on this topic. And I want to get going. Like I said, we're going to wrap up a little early. Per usual, send your questions in the chat. We'll read them off at the end. Let us know if you're liking what you're hearing. You know, I feel some energy in that chat tonight. So with that, Marzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Erin. And I am so excited to be here. I have watched Erin and this program Blueprint for, oh gosh, I think you first told me about this like 6 months ago almost. And I just cannot believe how much it's taken off. And I'm just so honored and thrilled to get to meet all the people that I've been hearing so much about for almost half a year. So I am also very excited to talk about and to so many amazing volunteers. This is just kind of the reason that I got into this work in the first place, is because of the relationships and people I get to meet through this. So I'll share my screen. I have a few, I kind of put some things down to keep myself mostly on track because I will get too excited about this. But just kind of starting off, the way that I think about, volunteer recruitment, volunteer teams is kind of inextricable from the entire campaign or initiative or activist project that you're doing. Volunteers are literally the campaign. I have, like Erin said, I've worked in a few different states now, and in every single state have seen so many different ways to build strong teams made up of the people on the ground or the people who really, really care about that particular area or field of work, whether it's voter protection or a congressional race or a state house race, or even like a ballot initiative. It is, the people who really care and are passionate about that issue who make up the campaign. Volunteers are literally the heart and the soul and the engine of campaigns. And I think my favorite campaign managers and directors I've ever worked for are the people who really recognize that and go out of their way to support organizers and to support volunteer teams. Volunteers are also, and I'm obviously saying things that you as volunteers already know, but you are the public face of campaigns and initiatives. Of course, the campaign manager does interviews, the comms director talks to press, but it is volunteers who spend the time every single day for weeks and months talking to voters and sharing why you care about this work and why you're doing this. You will have a more public persona in this work than practically anybody else involved. And so I never want to discount, the fact that you put yourself out there every single day to talk to people about things they may have never heard about before, they may have no interest in when you start the conversation, but as the public face of every campaign and every organization that you've ever worked with and worked for, you are the people out there who are putting the word out and changing people's hearts and minds and connecting with them where they are. The other thing that I really focus on when building my volunteer teams is just there's a place for everybody in this work. And as we get into a really hectic campaign season, I know it becomes even tougher to kind of figure out where we need to put our energy and where to plug people into our work. But I've found that the most effective volunteer programs are not the ones that try to make people into puzzle pieces that fit into a prearranged system. It's volunteer programs and organizations that mold around the strengths of the people around us. And so, acknowledging that folks have very different time commitments and flexible schedules, whether that's work or kids or hobbies or whatever you are doing in your life, the fact that you're making any time for us and our work is just, we're incredibly grateful for that. And we in return need to provide flexible opportunities and flexible schedules for people to get involved. And one way that I always do that in my work is particularly in this virtual space, since we are limited at this point in a lot of what I do to virtual organizing, phone banking, for example, is providing open resources to people. So whether that is a phone bank link that is open all the time, so you can make calls at 9 a.m., before you go to work, or, 8 p.m. after you're done putting your kids to bed. If you want to make calls, the resources are there for you. You do not have to show up at a set schedule every single day or week. And that has been a really crucial part of getting folks from every walk of life involved in this work and finding their own way to empower themselves and their neighbors too. People sometimes even set up, a time that we don't have a prearranged event to make calls with their neighbors outside or to talk about this work. And so providing people an open phone bank link, or a written FAQ, a description and resources that they can share, like Erin's done with Blueprint and the outreach toolkit, having those resources open to you at all times is such a crucial part of including people and lifting people up into this work. The other thing I always think about, the last thing here, is that a lot of the time, the staff that you might be working with on a certain campaign either have been volunteers themselves, will be volunteers. Many of you may have been or will become campaign staffers. And so that kind of pipeline's the wrong word, but the pipeline there is very close. And so, understanding that as a staffer, I want to help volunteers develop their skills so they can grow into the same positions and even higher than I am. My goal is to help people figure out where they fit in this campaign. And if they want to be staff on the next campaign cycle, that's like practically the most I could hope for, that someone feels so strongly about this and feels like they have the skills to do so. So I think also that all staff should be volunteering for other organizations when they can as well, to, find new options and best practices always. So this is probably the biggest thing that I think about in running my programs. And for a little bit of context, in my work as voter protection organizer in Wisconsin, we do a lot of work around voter education, outreach, and we do a ton of volunteer recruitment where we recruit poll workers to work the election next year. We recruit poll observers who are kind of our eyes and ears on the ground on election day. We have a hotline, a voter assistance hotline that we recruit volunteers for. We do ballot cure calls for people whose absentee ballots get rejected. We call them and walk them through the process of curing their ballots so that their vote counts. All of these volunteer opportunities, though, it's wide ranging, but every single one has a pretty incredible impact, especially in our state. The way this state always goes in elections is we have absurdly small margins of victory and sometimes of loss as well. Donald Trump won Wisconsin by 22,000 votes in 2016. Joe Biden won last November by 20,000 votes. And that averages out to 2 or 3 votes per polling place. Our margin of victory last year was 2 votes per polling place. And I try to share that every time I do an event. I try to share that fact, those numbers with people, because it really puts the work that we do in context. I think it's really important to understand for volunteers, why are you making these 50 calls today, and what exactly is it going to do for the next election, or even years down the line? What does talking to one poll worker about working the election do? Well, in our state, you only need about 7 poll workers by law to open a polling place. So if I talk to 3 people tonight, Erin talks to 4, that's an entire polling place that we have now staffed and opened in our state that serves hundreds, if not thousands, of voters. And so I start pretty much every event that I run with volunteers by putting the event and our work in context of both the election that we're working at that moment and the wider state as a whole, and the electoral system here. We are unlucky enough to have one of the worst cases of gerrymandering in the country. And so it is something that is constantly at the forefront here and constantly reminding us why the work we do is so crucial. And in every state, though, as well, every single call and door and interaction that you have with voters, with new volunteers, with constituents, whatever it is, every single one has an impact. And even if you only talk to a few people on the phone, or a few people answer the door one day, Doing that effort paced over time for weeks or months is what wins elections. I know a lot of people often jump in right at the end of an election cycle. GOTV, get out the vote weekend, is of course one of our biggest weekends in organizing because a lot of people come right at the end. But I know there are a lot of folks on here who've been doing this work for a very long time and know that it is building these sustained relationships, pacing yourself over time, and continuing the small pieces of outreach every single day or week that is really what wins things, and also what empowers people, because we continue to come back to voters and volunteers and show them that they have a place in our initiatives and our activism. The other thing that I love to think about is the field margin. And this is, you've probably heard this before, but this is often what people in campaigns say when a race has a particularly small margin, whether it's statewide or even like a city council or school board. Field margin is when it is the volunteers and organizers who, making those calls and knocking on doors, won that race. When the race is won by so small that even a couple, volunteers less would have meant we lost, like that is a field margin. And so that matters on a statewide level like Wisconsin, as well as every single local race. Local races have such incredible impact on people's day-to-day lives, but most people don't think about that every single day. And so it's up to us to remind people the power that they have, the power in the field margin, and the power of talking to 2, 3, 4 voters every weekend for a few months. That is what is going to win us elections. And team building as a volunteer team, especially, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to continue building my team from last year of my volunteers. Something I found really helpful in that process is it's really important to share challenges and share successes. I end every single phone bank that I do by asking folks to share in the chat any good conversations they had or anything in particular that they learned. And every single time I learn new things. And we also, I also learn new questions that people are asking my phone bankers, and it helps me prepare better for next time. It also helps our volunteers to kind of put any challenges in context a little bit. Sometimes people are nasty on the phone, and I always want people to know that, you come first. You can hang up on someone. You can say thanks for your time and move on. And, let me know if that happens. We are always here to support our volunteers. We want to know that we share in the challenges and the successes together. And we want people to, just share those with each other. So, that even though it's COVID time and we're all on Zoom, that you are not alone just making calls into the void. I also use Slack and some other kind of virtual tools to build my volunteer team and to keep up connections with people throughout the year, even if we don't have an imminent election. And using tools like Slack or a Facebook page or even like a text group chat really help us stay in contact and become invested in each other's lives. One of my hotline managers, her name is Candace, her grandson was born, I think in July of last year of 2020. And I have seen pictures of her grandson, Ethan, pretty much every week of his life so far. And one day I hope to meet our hotline manager's grandson, but it is that kind of, sharing our lives together that makes this work even more impactful, because it's other real people on the side of Zoom who care as much about this as you do and are out there to support you no matter what happens, whether you have a hard day on the doors or you have a really hard day just in life. I also find explicit team building really important for accessibility. Of course, there are a lot of varying levels of people's familiarity with technology, especially in COVID times. It's become almost a requirement for participating in a lot of activities, which, makes sense considering we're in a virtual world now. But I think it's even more important for us to figure out different ways to make our programs accessible, whether that's captioning things, whether that's providing scripts and resources in advance so people have time to look them over, whether that's doing one-on-one trainings or calls with people to help them assuage any fears or concerns that they might have about the work. It's really important to look at our programs and our volunteer initiatives at every point to make sure they're accessible to as many people as we possibly can make them, especially with in-person events as well. Making sure that wherever you're holding the event has accessible parking or accessible paths, and is open to people of all physical abilities, and not just folks who might be able to, walk there or come over grass, or if someone doesn't have a car, do they have a way to get there, or even a way to get to their turf to canvas? And so just being flexible in the way we build our programs and putting accessibility at the forefront is such an important part of making sure everybody knows that they are welcome and wanted in our volunteer programs. And lastly, and similarly, diversity is really important. And sometimes in campaign spaces, I think, even looking at my own program, there's always room for improvement with this. A lot of the folks in my programs that I work with are white and retired, and a lot of these folks do amazing work and have dedicated their lives to this. But as a white person myself, I'm missing a perspective on a lot of this activism work because I do not have the life experience of a person of color or someone who has a disability. And so it is so important to recognize that and think of proactive ways to bring people of every walk of life into your program. And often that means direct outreach to groups who do work in underrepresented communities or marginalized communities, and asking for feedback, asking for help, or offering your services to them. And that's something we have to do really explicitly in the virtual world as well, because I'm not walking down the street or going to an event and bumping into people anymore. And so it has to be very explicit and dedicated. And so that's something that I have kept on my mind for many, many months now, and will continue to, hopefully, as we go back into in-person events eventually as well. So communication is probably one of my other kind of pillars of the volunteer experience. And if you asked my volunteers, they'll probably say that I am communicative up to an annoying point almost. Erin knows very well my favorite thing on the planet is confirmation calls. For every single event that I have ever done, and you all probably got a confirmation call for this too, I believe. I do a confirmation call and text to everybody who signed up. And that is extremely important to me as an organizer, that everybody who comes into my program knows that I want them to be there. I'm glad they're there, and I'm there to help them with every single step of the way, whether it's finding the Zoom link, getting onto Zoom, logging into things, preparing for the training, reading through the materials, or even just talking through exactly what we're going to be doing. I want to have a one-on-one connection with every single person, even if I've never met them before in my life, before we do the event. And so confirmation calls are one of the best ways to kind of maintain volunteer retention and communication with everybody in your program. It's also a great way for folks to just have a point of contact for a program. Again, in the virtual world, it is hard sometimes to find that one email, or if it went to spam or whatever it is, keeping things organized is tricky. And so having a text on your phone from the organizer where you can go right back to them and ask any questions is really crucial. In addition to calls and texts, though, I try to kind of diversify my methods of communication as well. So if some folks prefer email, I make a note of that and remember to only email them instead of call. Or if some people hate talking on the phone, I will text them instead. As I mentioned before, we use Slack. Some people prefer to use Slack over calling or texting. I even know folks who prefer Facebook or Facebook Messenger, Twitter, Instagram, DM. Everyone kind of has their preferred method of communication. And so I try to keep up with all of the options and meet people where they're at, and however they manage communication in their life. At the same time, though, especially as things get more hectic in election season, I do try to encourage folks to try new things. Most of my volunteers had never heard of Slack before. If you have never heard of Slack, it is like a messaging service or board where a group of people can all kind of have a giant group message together and post photos and files and things. It's very useful for campaign work and organizing. But a lot of my volunteers had never heard of that before. And so we spent a lot of time last year training people how to use Slack and where to look for messages and how to message me. And it ended up being extremely valuable for us on election day when we had rapid fire communication. And so just encouraging people to try new things and try new tech that they may not have done before. Even if it's brand new to them, we're there to walk them through it. We're there to practice before, the big day on election day, and leaving time for that as well. And regular communication with people is obviously crucially important for maintaining a volunteer base. I want to know about my volunteers' lives. I want to know what they're up to. I try as best I can to keep track of where people are at, their vacations, their trips, what they're doing, and when they can check back in with me. Not because I, want them to immediately come back and knock doors with me, just because I really care what they're doing in their lives. It also does help with accountability for folks, especially people who've never maybe done campaign work before and are kind of getting used to how a lot of campaigns structure things. Keeping in regular communication means you can check on someone when they miss a training that they said they were interested in coming to, and help them find a different date that works better for them. And just keeping people, accountable to things, as well as just giving them a method of talking to you if there was something that got in the way of them attending, or if they had some question that wasn't answered in advance. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is transparency. And I guess, Erin, if there are any questions, we can do questions at the end, or feel free to stop me, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, I'll give you kind of a countdown when we're getting close, so we make sure we squeeze in the questions.
Sounds good. Yeah. So transparency is something that in my work, I think a lot about. And I am not from Massachusetts. I do not know exactly all of your electoral and finance laws that you have here. But in my work as a voter protection organizer, this is something that I have to think very specifically about with my volunteers. So in Wisconsin, as well as a bunch of other states, we deal with a lot of complicated election laws, as well as campaign finance laws. And if that seems like it's coming out of left field on a volunteer training, it's okay. Where these laws often come in they limit us as political campaigns in exactly what we can do on the ground often. But I am very conscious of being transparent about our limitations with my volunteers. And so, for example, in Wisconsin, voter registration is something that we really need to do and want to do, but because of some of the laws that our former Republican Governor Scott Walker enacted, voter registration here is really tricky. It is tricky to run voter registration drives. And I often have volunteers come to me and say, like, I want to, be proactive and run a drive for voter registration. And rather than just saying, no, we can't do that, I try hard to be transparent about why exactly we aren't doing that right now, what we need to do it, and where our limits are. And I know as a volunteer, it can be really hard to hear that things out of either of our control are limiting us from doing the work we need to do. But that's where being creative comes in. There are always solutions to these things. There are always ways that we can come together and figure out a way to get to voters. Even if it isn't a typical voter registration drive, there are ways that we do talk to voters and get people registered here. We also have limitations in data. This is something I talk to volunteers a lot about. When you call into a phone bank and there are a ton of wrong numbers, some states just have really bad data collection on phone numbers. And that's something I also try to be transparent about, and also transparent that I am constantly trying to improve phone number data and email data and all the data points that we have that help us better target our efforts. Wisconsin, again, for example, has just very poor, just very, very low level of information that our voter file has. So when we get the list of every registered voter, it has virtually no information on them, which means that sometimes when we are trying to call Spanish speakers, we might not end up calling 100% Spanish speakers because we don't have perfect data. But being really transparent about where we get data, why we have targeted our efforts in a certain way with volunteers, I think is so important, because you all deserve to know those things. As much as we are able to share, I want you to understand who we're calling and why, and also why it might not be perfect. data is kind of the consistent, just consistent bother for organizers, because I would love to have one discrete phone number for every person on earth. We don't have that. So we often have to get creative with reaching out to people and just understanding that data is never going to be impeccable. The last part of transparency, and this is something that I am always working on myself as an organizer as well, is just understanding the need to prioritize. And that's for both organizers and for volunteers. Our priorities right now in this, quote, off year are very different from what my priorities will be a year from now. And I also it's important to me to be transparent about those things with my volunteers too. It's also that, often as volunteers, you work with one or two organizers who report to maybe a regional director, who reports to a deputy director, who reports to an organizing director, who reports to a state director. There is a massive kind of tree of people who are all making decisions about where to put volunteer efforts and where we should be focusing. And sometimes, sometimes I don't have control over those things. And I understand that my bosses sometimes have priorities that I might not agree with or might not understand at that time. And I always, though, try to ask every question I possibly can about those things so that I can communicate it effectively to my volunteers. Why are we in a certain neighborhood today instead of this other neighborhood? Or why are we calling this list instead of a different one? And just understanding that there are a lot of competing priorities in this work. And every volunteer and every organizer is doing their best at any given moment is also what I try to remind myself. Sometimes you get a rude person on the phone and it throws off your whole day, and that is okay. It happens to me all the time. The other thing with priorities is that off-year organizing like this year is so crucial. I think more than most people realize in most off years, especially right now after the massive efforts of millions of volunteers last year to elect Joe Biden and so many down ballot candidates, and to win the Senate, to flip Georgia and Arizona and Nevada and so many other states. It is even more important that we keep that work up now, because all the things that we wanted to do last year that we maybe had to push aside to focus on our singular goal of winning the election and winning down ballot races, that stuff we can do now. But we can only do it if we have the boots on the ground and the volunteer power and engagement that we need to pull it off. You all are here because you care about being a volunteer, you care about leading other volunteers. And I don't know, we really got to motivate ourselves and our friends and family and neighbors, even in an off year, even when there's not an election on the edge of fascism that we are facing. And I know we're getting a little close to time, so I will speed a little through this. But another thing I work on a lot with volunteers is skill building. And this is also relevant for any campaign staffer all the time, because there are a million different databases and systems that are used in this work. And so one of the big ones that I spend a lot of time training people on is Vote Builder. And some of you have probably used Vote Builder or VAN and GP VAN before. All of our favorite database. It's the database of voter data as well as volunteer outreach data. We also spend a lot of time in spreadsheets. At least in my work, we spend a lot of time looking at which voters are registered where, demographics, who's been reached out to when. And so helping volunteers get better spreadsheet skills and Google Sheet skills. We also spend a lot of time doing research, and whether that's on election laws and initiatives, or even like voter data. That is something we have spent a lot of time building skills in, researching voter data. And what I mean by that is this project that I wrote here called Inspector Gadget. And this is just kind of the cute name that we gave it last year. But last year during the election, a lot of people in Wisconsin were forced to vote provisional ballots, which they then had to cure before their vote would be counted. And so this group of provisional voters, we didn't have a ton of data on them. We didn't even have phone numbers for most. And so it was extremely difficult for us to reach out and help them cure their ballot. And so what we did was this project we called Inspector Gadget, where we used social media, we used Google, all sorts of resources to just try to find one point of contact for every voter. I DM'd people, I messaged people on Twitter for this. because we really wanted their vote to be counted. And for some folks, it was really hard to reach them, but my volunteers built really good, kind of internet research skills, figuring out where we can reach people. And, if they're a younger person, are they more likely to have a Facebook that we could message them on, something like that. And a lot of this is just about being creative and thinking outside the box and brainstorming how we can solve the problems we're faced with in every election. Because there's always stuff that comes out of left field that we're not prepared for. And so often staff and organizers and volunteers have to put our heads together to figure out how we're going to solve it. And this is something I am very, very passionate about, and something that's been so key in my programs both last year and especially this year. And Erin kind of touched on this, but recognizing volunteers' strengths is I think underutilized in campaigns often. While we do have focuses, like we have to win the election, we have to reach out to X number of voters, the method of doing that and who is doing it and how is, we can get creative there. And I know so many people come to this work with incredible experience and skills from other work or from life. And it is important to me that we take the time to recognize those things and figure out where they fit in and where they can better our program, because every single person comes into this work with something that can better our programs and better the entire district that we're working for, or the state or the community. And so for a lot of folks who might have leadership skills, for example, that might mean we level them up. And that's just a phrase that I use about volunteers who might start out as a phone banker or come into my program that way and then get really comfortable with it. And I might level them up and ask them to run a phone bank next and train other volunteers to phone bank, or explain to people what VPB and phone banking even is to begin with. For folks with tech experience, that might mean helping me clean a spreadsheet or figure out a spreadsheet and data that has been giving me a headache for weeks. And just capitalizing a little on the skills that people bring. And that's particularly important in this off year when many campaigns do not have even close to a full staff. Right now, I don't have any other organizers that I work with. And so getting help from my volunteers on things that have to be done, but that I'm struggling to get done alone is so, so important. Volunteers, I think, are also some of the best people to train other volunteers. It's kind of the power of the personal story is often brought up in canvassing and phone banking work. Telling other people why you are here and why you care is a better motivator and a better explanation than almost anything else anyone could say. And so, even teaching volunteers how to do trainings and then setting them free to use their skills and any skills they had before to empower other volunteers makes it into this just giant team of empowered people. And lastly, I kind of said this before though, encouraging volunteers to bring all of themselves to this work. People come to this with such different, life experiences. They might speak other languages or have been born not in the United States and be new to our political system, but passionate about helping us change it. And I want to know those things. That is so valuable to the work that we do, is a diversity of experience and just bringing other people into this work and becoming a huge team together. And so just bringing all of yourself to this work, encouraging the people, the voters, the volunteers you work with to bring all of themselves and not hide certain things because they think it might not fit with their idea of what a campaign volunteer should be. What a campaign volunteer should be is what all of you are. And I want that whole self in all of the work that we do. And I think this is the last thing that I had that I wanted to touch on here, is there's always room for improvement. No program or campaign is ever perfect. And so collaborating with my volunteers on kind of debriefing and feedback and where could things be better is so important. And I have gotten some of the best tips from my own volunteers going through my programs and telling me which things really worked and which things could be a little better, and then helping me change those things. I think some of the most successful parts of our program right now are things I collaborated with volunteers on, last fall to design. especially after big events or big, even like an election or, an early vote or GOTV weekend, collaborating and discussing what really worked and then replicating that, and then figuring out where things fell a little short and then making a solid plan to fix those things, as well as sharing best practices overall. This is something I think went really well in Georgia, and I know some folks on here worked in Georgia as well. Is it was kind of like a confluence of the best practices from every single campaign and state, because so many people came together to make that happen. And so just continuing to share best practices and sharing best practices and just telling people the things that you've seen work in other states. Like, I guarantee I have not thought of even half of the things that I could be doing, and I want to hear what's really worked for people in the past. And so the final thing I want to leave you with is I just want to acknowledge this work can be really, really hard. This work, activism and reaching out to voters, volunteering, it's for so many initiatives, like I know so many of you do, can be really draining and challenging, especially in a pandemic world where it feels like the world is burning all of the time, and the things that we're doing might feel hopeless sometimes, but it's not. It matters. We would not have won the election last year without every single one of you, whether you voted or volunteered or spoke to voters or knocked doors, whatever it was. Every single conversation last year, every single piece of outreach mattered. And it is really important at the same time, though, to take some time for yourself and recover from that. Last year was really draining for, I think, just about everybody who was involved, no matter how peripherally they were involved. And so taking some time, coming back to yourself for a little bit, giving yourself some time to rest before we get back into this work. And I think these trainings that Erin is doing are such a good way to do that, because you get to meet people from your state. You get to hear from so many amazing presenters. I've been looking at some of the schedules of what you guys have been doing, and it's just, what an opportunity. But it's such a good way to continue making connections while also, building your own skills and taking care of yourself. 2022 is going to be hard. It's going to be worth it. We're going to win. We're going to keep the Senate in Wisconsin. We are going to flip Ron Johnson's seat. Please God. He is our Republican senator who says something new and insane every single day. We are going to hold on to our governor's seat. Obviously, we won the recall in California yesterday. There are small and big wins everywhere. But I just want you all to know how much, as organizers, we appreciate your work and we appreciate your support. And you are what make this work happen. We literally could not do this without you. There are a finite number of calls I can make every single day and a finite number of events that I can help run. But with all of you and with all of your help in every single state, this is how we turn things around. So thank you guys so much for having me. I think, were there some questions, Erin?
Yeah, thank you so much, Marzi. I could sit here and think about you and talk about these things forever. It is just so heartwarming. One thing that Alex Bausch actually sent in the chat is something that we talked about in Georgia quite a bit, and something that happens, I think, in voter protection. There are a lot of lawyers that work in voter protection, and we love our lawyers. But there are sometimes lawyers writing our scripts. And there's a difference between an organizer, a volunteer writing a script, and lawyer jargon. And so Alex just really emphasized the fact that campaign staffers should be the ones creating these documents, and it should really be the people who are interacting with volunteers and the people doing the vast amount of the direct voter contact work. So you obviously have had experience with this. How do you go about crafting these scripts, and do you ever get the volunteers kind of inputs in them, or is there like a vetting process before you launch into those calls, or best practices for script writing?
Yeah, that's a great question, I think, and definitely like a hot topic on a lot of campaigns. Often kind of higher ups want input on scripts, but don't actually do the voter contact themselves. And sometimes, as I said before, sometimes we don't have control, but something that I always say in every single training I do is the script is a guide. The script is a guide for your conversation. It often has talking points you can use in your conversation, but by no means should you feel obligated to read it verbatim. If you're nervous and it's your first time or your 100th time phone banking and you want to use the script verbatim, go right ahead. That's what it's there for. But no matter what, the script is a guide, whether it's the worst script you've ever read or the best one, it is still a guide. And with my scripts, I try, well, first I make the calls myself and I write down what works for me. And I will often give myself a little outline when I start calling and, figure out what phrasing might work best for it. And then I translate that into a volunteer facing script. And then I also try to balance between having enough information that volunteers can answer questions that they might get while not giving a block of text like my magnum opus in the script. That's not necessary. And just kind of a balance between too much and too little information while making it conversational and readable. It's definitely hard, and I am not perfect at it. But I think probably my best strategy is to make the calls yourself first and stumble through it sometimes and figure out what really works, figure out what grabs people's attention, and note that when you're doing a training, say this line has really worked for me, or like this phrasing of this, or this question about the American Rescue Plan or something has really piqued people's interest.
Awesome. Marzi, we have one more question in the chat, and I think it's kind of the perfect way to close out. Jim Vetter wants to hear a little bit more about the organizing work that you're doing in Wisconsin during, quote, off years like this, which is so inspiring. So please tell us a little more about it.
Sure. Yeah, I would love to. So right now in Wisconsin, our two big focuses are we are recruiting poll workers, so election officials to run the election next year. We are up against a state deadline for that of November of this year, a full year before the midterm elections, that we're required to submit lists of poll workers. And so that is our biggest focus right now, is just getting folks involved as poll workers, speaking to experienced poll workers and making sure that they get rehired next year. For whatever reason, poll workers in Wisconsin is kind of a focal point for the Republican Party, and Steve Bannon keeps talking about, having their folks sign up to run the very election that they continue to say is fraudulent and illegitimate. So this is our big focus, is trying to make sure that lots of advocates for voters who believe in democracy are working the polls next year. Our other focus is some voter registration work. It has changed shape a little bit as the Delta variant has gone up and scrapped some in-person plans, but it is still very much something that we're doing actively right now and are hoping to be doing more of in the future, whether it's calling people or doing in-person voter registration drives. As I mentioned, it is tricky in our state to get voters registered en masse. And so it's something that we are trying to figure out how to navigate in the virtual world and just make as effective as possible. Data on unregistered voters is extremely hard to come by, especially in our state, because the state doesn't collect very much information on voters to begin with, let alone unregistered voters. So that's currently our focus. And then next year, we have 4 elections in Wisconsin, which we have a lot of elections every year. We have 4 next year, and we will be sending out poll observers who are volunteers for our team. We will have our hotline up and running where we answer questions from any voter who calls in about anything they need help with. We will continue to recruit some poll workers, though in a slightly different way than we are this year, and register voters and provide voter education materials to our organizing team and to the entire state. So that's kind of the, I guess, my 2-minute version of our work.
Thank you so much, Marzi. I'm going to let everyone go, but as I always do, I'll send a follow-up email, and maybe I know for a fact that Marzi hosts a slew of phone banks. Probably could use out-of-state help. We know Mass is a great export state, so maybe some people have some time on their hands. Anyway, thank you so much for joining. Please, I know I say this every time, but if you have been to these trainings but haven't been a part of our larger organizing structure, there's a community we're building here. There's such great organizing happening. I've been so excited getting to know every single one of you. So please, please, please email me. I dropped my email in the chat, and we'll keep doing this work. Marzi, thank you again, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you. Have a good night.